The old man sat by the window of a small roadside diner, his trembling hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes, pale and distant, seemed to stare through the glass but saw nothing in particular, only fragments of memories that no longer aligned. The faint hum of conversation and the clinking of utensils filled the air, yet no one paid him any attention. To the world, he was just another forgotten soul, one of those elderly faces marked by time and confusion. His coat was frayed, his shoes scuffed, and his once strong frame now hunched with fragility. Every now and then he muttered something under his breath. Names, perhaps, or places that only he could remember. People around him rolled their eyes or shook their heads, some with pity, most with impatience. The waitress behind the counter glanced his way briefly, but was too busy serving others to notice the vacant sorrow in his expression. He had been coming to that diner every morning for weeks, always at the same time, always sitting in the same booth. The staff had stopped asking for his order. He only ever asked for coffee and sometimes forgot to pay. Some of the younger waiters whispered that he was senile, that he probably didn't even know where he was. Others thought he was homeless, drifting from one place to another, looking for warmth in the smell of food and human chatter. Yet nobody truly saw him. They served him mechanically, avoiding his eyes, avoiding the awkwardness of having to pretend they cared. The veteran didn't remember much about his life anymore. The war had taken pieces of him, and time had taken the rest. His mind was a broken record, skipping between moments of clarity and long stretches of emptiness. Sometimes he'd see flashes of uniformed men, gunfire, laughter, a home with white curtains, a little girl running into his arms. Then the images would blur and fade, leaving him adrift in the fog of his illness. That morning, something different happened. A new waitress started her shift, a young black woman named Keisha. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd worked hard for everything she had. Her eyes caught the old man right away, his frail fingers trembling as he tried to sip from his cup. He had spilled some coffee on the table, and no one bothered to clean it. She approached him quietly, offering a warm smile that he didn't seem to notice at first. When she asked if he wanted a refill, he looked at her blankly, his eyes cloudy with confusion. She poured the coffee anyway, gently wiping the table with a napkin. He watched her hand move, his expression softening as though something familiar flickered behind his lost gaze. The other customers barely glanced their way, but Keisha stayed by his side a moment longer than usual. She noticed the military pin on his coat pocket, tarnished but still proudly fastened. "You served?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer. His lips quivered before he nodded slowly. "Long time ago," he whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. She smiled and said, "Thank you for your service." He blinked, as if her words had pulled him back from somewhere far away. For the first time in weeks, he felt seen, like a human being rather than a ghost wandering through routine. The sound of her voice carried warmth, something his world had been missing for far too long. Keisha checked on him often during her shift, bringing him extra napkins, a slice of pie he didn't order, and even sitting across from him when the place quieted down. She didn't see an old man with dementia. She saw someone's father, someone's husband, someone who once had stories to tell. When he reached for his pocket to find his wallet, fumbling with the buttons and sighing in frustration, she gently stopped him and said, "Don't worry about it today, sir. It's on me." The man froze, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. His eyes glistened, not because of gratitude, but because some distant memory stirred within him. A kindness once shown to him long ago, maybe during the war, maybe by a loved one. His mind couldn't place it, but his heart recognized the feeling. From that moment, a subtle shift occurred. The people who once ignored him began to watch as Keisha treated him with a tenderness they didn't understand. The old man began to talk in fragments, recalling bits of his past between sips of coffee. "Used to build things," he said once, looking out the window. "Bridges, roads, companies, maybe? I can't remember." Keisha listened without interrupting, nodding as though every word mattered. The manager of the diner looked disapprovingly at her for spending so much time with one customer, but she didn't care. There was something about him that drew her in, a heaviness that needed to be lifted, even if only by her presence. Over the next few days, the old man began to remember more when she was around. The fog in his eyes cleared for moments at a time, and small smiles began to return to his face. He even brought her a small crumpled photo one morning, a faded image of a younger man in a military uniform standing beside a woman and child. "My family," he murmured, "or maybe someone else's. I don't know anymore." Keisha placed her hand over his and said, "They must have loved you very much." He nodded weakly, staring at the photo as though trying to bring it to life again. She didn't know that the picture she held was once printed on the cover of a major newspaper decades ago, when the man in the photo had been listed among the most influential industrialists in the country. The world outside continued to rush by, indifferent and loud, but inside that small diner, something sacred unfolded quietly. Keisha's compassion reached a part of him untouched by illness, a reminder that even when the mind forgets, the soul remembers kindness. She didn't know who he truly was, and he didn't know who she might become, yet their brief connection defied the apathy surrounding them. The regulars who once ignored him began to notice how his eyes followed her when she walked by, how he seemed calmer, steadier, more present. It was as if her empathy had anchored him to reality again, even for fleeting moments one afternoon. When the diner was nearly empty, the old man clutched her hand suddenly, his eyes wide with clarity. He whispered her name, though she had never told it to him, and said something about a will, about a foundation, about helping those who remember to care. His words came out in fragments, his breathing uneven, his thoughts slipping again into confusion. Keisha didn't understand the meaning behind them, nor did she realize that the man she comforted was one of the richest individuals in the state, living quietly in the shadows of his forgotten legacy. To her, he was just a lonely veteran who needed someone to hold his hand when the world had turned its back on him. To him, she was the last light of humanity he would ever see before disappearing once more into the mist of his fading mind. Keisha didn't think much of it when she first reached out and took the old man's hand. His skin was cold and paper-thin, his fingers trembling with the uncertainty of someone trapped between the present and the past. She had seen people like him before, lonely elders who came into the diner not for food, but for a sliver of human connection. Yet something in his eyes caught her attention, something beyond confusion. There was a strange intelligence behind the fog, like a mind that still burned brightly somewhere deep within, struggling to be seen. When she smiled and asked if he was okay, he blinked, and for a moment it was as if time folded on itself. "You remind me of someone," he murmured, his voice quivering. The words were barely audible, but they carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She squeezed his hand gently, unsure what to say, but knowing instinctively that he needed this moment of contact more than any words around them. Life in the diner went on as usual. The kitchen hissed with the sound of frying oil, laughter spilled from a group of students in the corner, and a couple argued quietly over their meal. No one noticed the quiet exchange between the veteran and the waitress. No one saw how his trembling stopped as he felt the warmth of her hand, how the lines of distress on his face softened into something almost peaceful. For weeks, he had sat alone at that same booth, unseen and unheard, his presence blending into the dull background of routine. But today, Keisha's kindness had pierced through the fog that Alzheimer's had built around his mind, pulling him, if only briefly, back into the light of awareness as the day went on. Keisha checked on him more than once. She brought him another cup of coffee, fresh and steaming this time, along with a slice of apple pie. He looked down at it, puzzled. "I didn't order this," he said. "I know," she replied softly. "You look like you could use something sweet." A faint smile crossed his lips, uncertain at first, then genuine. He picked up his fork and took a small bite, closing his eyes as though the taste reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. His mind drifted, flashes of an old farmhouse kitchen, a woman laughing as she baked, the smell of cinnamon and apples filling the air. For years, those memories had been locked away, unreachable, but somehow her presence had cracked open the door. Keisha didn't know she was stirring ghosts of a life that had been buried under years of silence and decay. That evening, as the diner began to empty, A man in a suit entered and sat at the counter. He looked out of place, his polished shoes tapping impatiently on the floor. He kept glancing toward the old man in the corner as if watching him from a distance. Keisha noticed but didn't ask questions. When she refilled the man's coffee, he leaned in and said quietly, "Has he been coming here often?" She hesitated, unsure if she should answer. "Every morning," she finally said. "He likes that booth." The man nodded, his jaw tightening. "Does he talk much?" She shook her head. "Not really. Sometimes he forgets where he is." The suited man sighed, thanked her, and left without finishing his drink. Keisha didn't realize that the man was an attorney, a legal representative assigned to keep track of the veteran's whereabouts. To make sure he didn't wander too far from the facility he was supposed to stay in, the next morning, the veteran returned wearing the same worn coat, the same faded pin on his lapel. He carried a small envelope this time, tucked carefully into his breast pocket. When Keisha greeted him, he smiled faintly, recognizing her face instantly, though her name still escaped him. "You," he said, pointing gently toward her. "You make the noise go quiet." She laughed softly, unsure what he meant, but she stayed close as she served him. When he struggled to open the sugar packet with his trembling hands, she reached over to help, and that was when the envelope fell onto the table. He picked it up and looked at it as if it were a foreign object. "What's that?" she asked. He stared at it, then slid it across the table toward her. "It's for you, I think," he said. "You've been kind?" Keisha frowned, hesitant to take it. "I can't, sir. You don't even know me." But he insisted, his cloudy eyes brimming with sincerity. "You remind me of someone I once trusted." She smiled awkwardly, tucking the envelope into her apron pocket, thinking it was just a note or a small token of thanks. The day went on as usual, and she forgot about it until her shift ended. When she finally opened the envelope in the locker room, she froze. Inside was a check written in trembling handwriting, signed by a name she didn't recognize, but the amount was enough to make her heart race. She thought it was a mistake, a confusion born from his illness, and decided she'd return it the next day. She didn't know that the signature at the bottom belonged to one of the wealthiest and most powerful businessmen in the country, whose vast empire stretched across industries from construction to finance. The following morning, she arrived early, intending to give it back, but the booth was empty. His coffee cup sat untouched, and the air around the window seat felt strangely hollow. The manager told her that a private car had picked him up earlier that morning, and that he wouldn't be coming back. Something in her chest sank, a sadness she couldn't explain. She slipped the envelope into her bag and stepped outside, staring at the street as if expecting to see him walking toward her again. Over the next few days, she asked around, but no one knew anything. Then, about a week later, a black limousine pulled up outside the diner. A man stepped out, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, holding a briefcase. He asked for Keisha by name. The manager called her over nervously, and the man introduced himself as the executor of a private estate. He handed her another envelope, thicker this time, with an embossed seal. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter written in neat cursive on heavy paper. "Dear Keisha," it began, "you held my hand when the world turned away. I remembered who I was because of you. I remembered what mattered. I want you to continue what I started. The enclosed documents will help you do so." Beneath the letter were legal papers confirming that she was now the beneficiary of a significant trust fund, a portion of the late veteran's wealth, dedicated to supporting Alzheimer's patients and caregivers. Her name had been added just days before his passing, authorized by his personal attorney. The man she had served coffee to, the one everyone ignored, had once been a billionaire industrialist who had lost everything to his illness, except the memory of kindness. Her simple gesture, that single moment of human touch, had reminded him of the humanity he had once lived for. As the attorney explained the details, Keisha's mind swirled with disbelief. She thought of his trembling hands, his confusion, the soft gratitude in his eyes when she smiled. She had never imagined that her kindness could ripple into something so immense. Later that night, she sat alone in the same booth where he had once sat, staring out the window at the quiet street beyond. The reflection of the diner lights shimmered on the glass, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw him sitting across from her again, smiling faintly, the fog of his illness gone from his eyes. She reached out, touching the empty space between them, her heart heavy with the realization that what she had seen as a small act of compassion had, in truth, uncovered a legacy far greater than she could have ever imagined. News of the veteran's true identity spread quietly at first, whispered among the diner's regulars before reaching the broader town. People who had once overlooked him now spoke of him with awe and disbelief. They remembered the old man who sat by the window murmuring to himself, his coat worn thin, his eyes distant. None of them had known that beneath the fragile exterior of a man lost to Alzheimer's resided one of the wealthiest industrialists in the country. A man whose businesses had shaped cities, built bridges, and employed thousands. His fortune had remained hidden, untouched, because he had long since forgotten it existed. But what struck people most wasn't the revelation of his wealth. It was the story of how he had been seen, truly seen, only when a young waitress took the time to hold his hand. Before that moment, he had been invisible. People had treated him as a nuisance, a ghost of society's past. They offered forced smiles or ignored him entirely, thinking his life had already ended in everything but breath. The diner patrons who once averted their eyes now found themselves ashamed of their silence. They recalled how he had sometimes struggled to pay for his coffee, how he'd been mocked quietly by younger customers, how no one ever asked him his name. Yet that one act of empathy, Keisha's hand resting on his, had broken the barrier of indifference. It had reminded everyone that dignity does not disappear with memory, that kindness holds more power than status or appearance. In a world obsessed with wealth and image, it was the poorest woman in the room who had recognized the richest man's humanity. Keisha didn't fully understand the scale of what she had done until the attorney came back to see her weeks later. He told her that the veteran, before his passing, had revised his estate to include a foundation bearing both their names. The purpose of the foundation was to fund care programs for veterans suffering from memory loss and to train caregivers to offer compassion, not just medical assistance. It was his final wish, inspired by her small but life-altering act of empathy. When the news reached the media, reporters swarmed the diner, snapping photos and asking endless questions. They wanted to know what it felt like to discover that the man she served pie to every morning had been a billionaire. But Keisha's answer never changed. "I didn't see a billionaire," she said. "I saw a man who needed someone to care." The contrast between how he had been treated before and after the revelation became a mirror for everyone who had ignored him. People who once dismissed the old man as that confused veteran suddenly came forward claiming they had known him, that they had always admired his humility. But Keisha saw through it all. She had witnessed how quickly compassion could turn to hypocrisy when money was involved. Yet she also understood that the old man's final gift wasn't the inheritance. It was the lesson he left behind. Kindness freely given had uncovered truth that wealth alone could never reveal. His billions had built towers, but it was her touch that built a legacy of humanity. As months passed, Keisha became the face of the new foundation. She gave speeches, attended community events, and told the story of the forgotten veteran whose silence spoke louder than any fortune. People listened with tears in their eyes, some out of guilt, others out of inspiration. The story resonated far beyond the diner. It spread across social media, news outlets, and television. It became a symbol of what it meant to see beyond the surface, to value people not for what they had, but for who they were. Donors reached out, veterans organizations partnered with her, and soon the foundation began opening centers across the country. Each one bore the same inscription on the entrance wall: "Compassion is the currency of humanity." Keisha's life changed completely. Yet she remained the same humble woman who once wiped down diner tables and served strangers with a smile. She kept her old uniform folded neatly in a drawer as a reminder of where it all began. She never let fame or wealth distort the meaning of what had happened. She often visited the diner on quiet mornings, sitting by the window where he used to sit. She would bring a cup of black coffee and place it across from her, letting the steam rise into the sunlight. In those moments, she felt his presence, the faint echo of his gratitude lingering in the air. Sometimes she imagined his voice saying, "You remembered me when I couldn't remember myself." Those words guided her through every decision, every speech, every new center they opened under his name. What fascinated people most was how completely the tables had turned. Before the waitress's kindness, the veteran's immense wealth had meant nothing. He had been just another forgotten old man in a world that measures worth by productivity and memory. But when the truth came out, it wasn't his financial empire that people admired. It was the purity of the moment that had reconnected him to life. Keisha's touch had been simple, human, uncalculated. There was no ulterior motive, no expectation of reward. In an age where compassion was often performed for recognition, hers had been real, and that authenticity carried a power no fortune could buy. It exposed the truth that money could not shield anyone from loneliness, that even the richest man becomes poor when stripped of love and dignity. The community transformed because of that revelation. The diner became a local landmark, not for its food, but for its story. People began leaving notes on the booth where he once sat, thank you letters to strangers, apologies to loved ones they had ignored, words of encouragement to veterans still struggling to be seen. A framed photograph of him now hung above the booth, alongside a simple plaque bearing his full name and a short line, "He remembered kindness when all else was lost." Keisha refused to let anyone turn his story into a spectacle of pity or wealth. For her, it was about the quiet power of empathy, the way one moment of genuine care could ripple outward, changing lives far beyond its origin years later. When the foundation had grown into one of the largest veteran support networks in the nation, Keisha still carried the same sense of humility. She knew that her life had been changed not by luck, but by love. The veteran's fortune had given her resources, but his story had given her purpose. Every time she visited one of the care centers, she would sit with the patients, hold their hands, and listen to their fragmented stories, just as she once had with him. Many of them didn't remember her name, but she didn't mind. She knew now that the act of caring was its own reward, that compassion didn't need to be remembered to matter. What stayed with her most was how easily the world had ignored a man until his worth was measured in dollars instead of dignity. In the end, his legacy became more than just a foundation. It became a reminder of what society too often forgets. It taught people that every interaction, no matter how small, holds the potential to uncover hidden worth. It showed that behind every quiet figure sitting alone, there might be a story of greatness waiting to be recognized. Keisha's kindness had revealed not just a billionaire's secret, but the deeper truth that wealth and status fade while humanity endures. The old man had once been surrounded by riches, yet died remembering only the warmth of a stranger's hand. His story reminded everyone who heard it that compassion, not money, is the true measure of a person's legacy.